Power didn't corrupt him. Applause did. Commodus wasn't like other emperors. He didn't want to rule. He wanted to be adored. He killed lions in the arena. He forced nobles to fight for his amusement. He made Rome his stage and the empire his toy. But when the laughter stopped and his closest allies saw their names on a kill list, they chose silence no more. This is the story of a golden monster, a poisonous betrayal, and the night the empire's most insane ruler was drowned by his own slave. When Commodus walked into the Colosseum for the first time, not as a spectator but as a fighter, dressed head to toe in the armor of a secular gladiator, with a bronze helmet covering his royal face, a short sword in one hand and a rounded shield in the other, the people of Rome didn't know whether to cheer or tremble, because this was not how emperors behaved. Emperors ruled from thrones, from palaces, from behind walls of gold and guards, not from the blood-soaked sand of an arena. And yet here was Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, stepping into the pit like a common slave, grinning beneath the mask, his voice echoing through the Colosseum as he shouted for silence before raising his arms like a god ready to judge. And from that moment on, the people knew this was not going to be a reign of reason, but a reign of madness, performance, and fear, because Commodus wasn't interested in ruling the empire. He was obsessed with ruling its attention, and he would get it, one brutal show at a time. And it all started after the death of his father, Marcus Aurelius, a man who had fought wars, written philosophy, and tried to teach his son discipline and wisdom. But none of it stuck, because Commodus was never meant to be emperor. He was meant to be adored, to be feared, to be worshipped. And now that the throne was his, he wasted no time turning it into a stage, dressing not in imperial robes but in gladiator gear, training with real fighters, practicing swordplay for hours while the affairs of state were left to rot. And when the Senate begged him to focus on governing, he laughed and called them old fools, threatening to dissolve the Senate entirely and rule as a living god, a second Hercules, reborn in flesh. And soon he declared that every month would feature games in his honor, not just for entertainment, but for his own pleasure. And he would enter the Colosseum, cheered by tens of thousands, to face animals, criminals, and sometimes even trained gladiators who had been ordered not to harm him under pain of death. And the crowd, half afraid and half thrilled, watched their emperor strike down men and beasts alike, his sword flashing in the sun as blood sprayed across the sand. And after each fight, he would raise his arms to the sky, demanding applause, demanding worship. And slowly, the people gave it to him, not out of love, but out of terror, because those who didn't cheer loud enough sometimes disappeared. Their names erased, their homes burned, and the whispers began to spread that Commodus was not just mad, but dangerous. And even worse, he believed his own lies, calling himself the Roman Hercules, having statues of himself carved with a club and lion skin, renaming the months of the year after his titles, and even changing the name of Rome to Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, so that all who lived in it would be living under his name. And while the empire suffered from inflation, corruption, and unrest at the borders, Commodus ignored it all, focused only on his next performance, his next fight, and his next round of applause. And behind the scenes, the court became a place of paranoia, betrayal, and death, as advisors who questioned him were executed. Generals who showed too much influence were poisoned, and anyone who reminded him of his father's discipline was removed, until the palace was filled not with leaders but flatterers, cowards, and monsters, all feeding Commodus's ego, all cheering for him as he strangled the empire with his madness. And yet, the emperor believed he was loved, believed he was divine, and as he stepped into the arena again and again, 735 times over the years, he kept pushing the limits, fighting exotic beasts, tying men to stakes and killing them with arrows, forcing wounded soldiers to dress like monsters so he could slay them in front of crowds, and even entering the arena with a trident and net, pretending to be a retiarius for sport, but never truly risking his own life, because everyone knew the fights were rigged. And those who bled for him were often prisoners, slaves, or condemned men who begged for mercy and found none. Because Commodus didn't fight for justice, he fought for his image, and soon his madness spilled into policy. He raised taxes to fund more games, drained the treasury to build statues of himself, and turned the empire's vast resources into fuel for his endless hunger for spectacle. And as Rome's borders weakened and enemies grew bolder, the emperor paid no attention, too busy planning his next entrance into the arena, where he would be greeted not as a man, but as a god of death, adored and feared. And so the empire watched, helpless, as its ruler transformed from a prince into a parody of heroism. A man who held all the power of Rome in one hand and a blood-stained sword in the other, grinning beneath a gladiator's helmet, believing he was eternal, invincible, divine. And behind that grin, the first cracks of chaos had begun to spread. Because while the crowd roared and the blood flowed, the empire itself was beginning to rot from the inside, and everyone could smell it. As the sun rose over the eternal city, casting its golden light on the marble columns and tiled rooftops of Rome, the people stirred not for prayer, not for duty, but for one purpose only: to watch their emperor kill, because today was another day of the games, and that meant Commodus would descend once again into the bloody heart of the Colosseum. Dressed in the armor of a gladiator, his skin oiled and bronzed, his golden hair brushed to perfection, and his eyes wild with the fever of performance, and the people filled the arena with a strange mix of awe and dread. For though they chanted his name, Commodus, Commodus, they knew deep down that this was not entertainment, this was worship by force, demanded by a man who saw himself not just as ruler, but as a god made flesh, a hero in the style of Hercules, destined to slay monsters and criminals alike. And as he stepped into the arena that morning, gripping his short sword with pride, the guards flanked him like attendants of a divine being, ensuring nothing interrupted the show. And then the first opponent emerged, a huge shackled prisoner with scars across his chest and eyes wide with fear. And the crowd held their breath, knowing the match would not be fair, because Commodus never allowed fairness in the games, only the illusion of danger. And as the emperor danced forward and thrust his blade into the man's throat, the cheers erupted, not because the kill was glorious, but because the people feared what would happen if they stayed silent. And from that moment, the blood did not stop, for Commodus had arranged an entire week of games in his honor, 7 days of violence, where he would fight beasts, crippled men, amputees dressed as mythical creatures, even trained gladiators ordered to fall dramatically before his blade. And in the palace, marble statues of him were unveiled daily, showing him with the strength of a god, standing atop piles of corpses, his sword raised in triumph. And he demanded every Roman citizen not only attend the games, but pay for them, raising taxes across the empire to fund his obsession. And in the provinces, governors struggled to keep their regions stable, begging for military reinforcements, food supplies, and silver to pay the soldiers. But Commodus answered none of their messages, too busy choosing which animal he would kill next: a lion from Africa, a rhinoceros from India, or perhaps a bear shipped in from the cold forests of the north. And he would appear in the arena in elaborate costumes, sometimes wearing a lion's head, other times painting his face like Mars, the god of war, and the crowd, forced to cheer, watched as he loosed arrows into the skulls of tied-down beasts, laughing as they died slowly, all while musicians played and dancers performed in the background, turning the bloodshed into a twisted ballet of cruelty. And behind the scenes, the senators muttered in secret, furious that the empire was being ruled by a man who treated governance like theater, who ignored the law, who sold positions of power to the highest bidder, and who allowed his favorites, men like Cleander, his corrupt chamberlain, to run Rome like a brothel of bribery and violence. And yet none dared oppose him openly, for Commodus had spies in every corner of the city, and those who were caught whispering dissent vanished into the night, their bodies found floating in the Tiber or buried in shallow graves beyond the city walls. And so the Senate played its part, standing to applaud him after each game, declaring him divine, eternal, invincible, even as they wept in private for what Rome had become. And day after day, the games continued, with Commodus fighting sometimes 2, sometimes 3 times a day, demanding to be called not emperor, but victor of 1,000 battles. And he kept detailed records of each stage victory, 735 in total, engraving them into monuments and forcing poets to write of his greatness. And if they refused or hesitated, he had them executed or fed to the same beasts he slaughtered in the arena. And still the people came, some out of morbid fascination, others out of terror, filling the seats and throwing roses at his feet, while starving orphans begged in the alleys outside, while plague returned to parts of the city, while provinces burned with rebellion and foreign enemies began testing the weakened Roman borders. And yet Commodus remained obsessed only with his next entrance, his next costume, his next dramatic pose, believing the gods watched him with pride and the people adored him truly. And when the high priests objected to his sacrilegious performances, desecrating sacred rites by mixing them with bloodsport, he simply had new priests installed, ones who would praise him as both emperor and divine executioner. And the empire slowly began to feel not like Rome, but like a traveling circus ruled by a madman in armor, a man who believed his own myth so completely that no truth could pierce it. And the people began to murmur again, quietly, that Marcus Aurelius must be spinning in his grave, that the great philosopher emperor who died in a soldier's tent would never have imagined his son dressing in leather and silk, fighting crippled men in front of cheering mobs, renaming the months after himself, and placing his face on every coin, every banner, every street corner. And still Commodus fought, and the Colosseum ran red, and the Senate stayed silent, and Rome, drunk on fear and blood, kept clapping. By the third year of Commodus's reign, Rome no longer felt like the empire built by Augustus or ruled with wisdom by Marcus Aurelius. It felt like the private playground of a man who had completely lost the line between fantasy and reality, a city soaked in wine, fear, and blood, where the emperor declared himself not just the ruler of men, but the living incarnation of Hercules, renaming the empire itself Colonia Commodiana, forcing all public prayers and oaths to be directed not toward Jupiter or Mars, but to Commodus alone. And wherever he walked, citizens were ordered to bow and chant his newest titles: Invincible, son of Jupiter, conqueror of 1,000 gladiators, bringer of peace through the sword. And though many mouthed the words out of fear, they all knew that behind the imperial smile was a man consumed by madness, whose obsession with fame and violence was growing more dangerous by the day. And every week the games grew longer, bloodier, more theatrical, with Commodus arriving in golden chariots pulled by white horses, sometimes dressed as a gladiator, other times painted in gold leaf from head to toe, his body displayed like a living statue as he paraded past the masses, blowing kisses before descending into the arena where the sand had not yet dried from the blood spilled just moments earlier. And it was said that Commodus had a special affection for fighting wild animals, though in truth the beasts were often starved, drugged, or even crippled before they entered the arena to ensure his safety. And he would slay them from a raised platform with a bow or spear, sometimes killing a dozen in one appearance, claiming each kill as proof of his divine strength, and, after each game, he would walk among the corpses, planting his foot on them for artists to sketch, later commissioning paintings and marble sculptures of himself in the pose of Hercules slaying the Nemean lion. And though many in Rome began to whisper about the emperor's behavior, no one dared speak aloud, for Commodus had transformed the imperial court into a web of paranoia, with spies planted in households, bathhouses, temples, and marketplaces, listening for even the slightest insult, the faintest hesitation in praise. And when a senator was overheard calling the emperor's games a circus for fools, he was dragged from his home at night, his body found the next morning nailed to the gates of the Colosseum, a warning written across his chest. Only gods may be judged by mortals. And after that, the Senate did not merely obey, they groveled, passing absurd laws to please their ruler, one declaring Commodus to be the first and last god of the arena, another proclaiming his breath to be sweeter than the perfumes of Arabia. And still he was not satisfied, because Commodus believed Rome existed for one reason, to love him, and the more he demanded adoration, the more he created fear, and the more fear grew, the more isolated he became, surrounded not by advisors but sycophants, flatterers who encouraged his delusions, cheered as he slaughtered defenseless criminals, and helped him rename every single month of the year after one of his titles, turning July into Commodus Invictus and October into Commodus the Gladiator, until the Roman calendar itself became a hymn to his ego, and even the palace was transformed, with mosaics torn up and replaced with images of the emperor fighting beasts. His previous portraits replaced with busts showing him as a god with divine muscles and thunderbolts in his hand, and the empire's treasury, once filled by conquests and taxes, was now nearly empty, drained to fund the endless games, payoffs, parades, and gifts Commodus handed out to the mob to maintain their loyalty. And when his advisors warned him of the looming financial collapse, he executed them and replaced them with favorites who told him what he wanted to hear. Men like Seoterus, his freedman chamberlain, who grew so powerful that he was called the second emperor, until Commodus turned on him too, stabbing him to death in a rage over a rumor that he had mocked his performance in the arena. And soon after, the real power behind the throne became Cleander, a former slave who now controlled the palace, the army, the food supply, and the courts, selling public offices to the highest bidder, and growing so wealthy that the people of Rome began to starve while the imperial household dined on golden platters, and riots erupted in the streets, only to be crushed by the Praetorian Guard, who were now nothing more than Commodus's personal applause squad. And still the emperor ignored it all, too obsessed with the arena, too consumed by fantasies of himself as the eternal gladiator god. And the games continued, each one more grotesque than the last, with actors forced to reenact Greek myths only to be killed for real on stage, criminals dressed as monsters and hacked apart for the crowd's amusement, and Commodus standing in the center of it all, bathed in blood, his arms raised, basking in the screams, the trumpets, the rose petals raining down from the stands. And it was in those moments, with his chest heaving and his sword dripping red, that he truly believed he was divine. And the empire, trembling and decaying around him, had no choice but to pretend it believed too. The emperor no longer lived in Rome, but in a fantasy carved from marble and drenched in blood, where every whisper was scripted, every face painted with false smiles, and every mirror reflected not the truth, but the illusion Commodus demanded to see. A world where he was eternal, beloved, feared, and divine, and the palace had become a twisted theater, filled with golden statues of Commodus dressed as Hercules, lions carved into the walls, ceilings painted with scenes of his gladiator victories, and fountains that gushed not just water, but rose-scented oils. All while outside the gates, real citizens starved, and the empire crumbled under the weight of neglect, because Commodus had stopped pretending to be a ruler and now lived as a performer trapped in the role of his own invention, waking each day not to govern, but to rehearse, to oil his muscles, polish his weapons, and practice his triumphant poses for the arena. And he demanded his servants refer to him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, under threat of execution, and those who hesitated, even for a moment, vanished, their names scratched from records, their families forced into silence, and his court followed suit, wearing masks of joy while hiding eyes full of dread, knowing that even a misstep in applause could mean death. And Commodus, high on his own image, surrounded himself with new favorites, actors, wrestlers, dancers, even slaves, people who knew nothing of empire or duty, but knew how to flatter, how to cheer, how to feed the hunger in his ego. And the Senate, now powerless, watched in horror as their authority was stripped away, their voices silenced, their meetings turned into parodies where bills were passed by decree, not debate, and every new law praised the emperor's beauty, strength, and genius, even going so far as to require every public statue in the city to bear his face, every military standard to carry his name, and even every child born in the empire to be registered under his glory. And while the gods of Rome were once many, now there was only one in the public eye. Commodus the gladiator, Commodus the god, Commodus the unconquered. And yet behind the silk curtains and the roar of crowds, the empire was rotting, its borders left undefended as generals struggled to hold back Germanic tribes and revolts flared in Egypt and Britain. But when word reached Commodus of the chaos, he dismissed it all as lies, calling reports of unrest jealous slanders from weak men. And instead he planned more games, more processions, more bloody performances. Because in the arena, he controlled the story, the outcome, the applause, and each time he killed a man or beast in front of 50,000 roaring citizens, he felt alive, powerful, reborn, as though the throne of Rome were not enough. He needed the sand beneath his feet and the blade in his hand to feel real. And one day he ordered the games to reflect the labors of Hercules, commissioning a full week of reenactments where he would appear as the mythical hero and slay beasts representing chaos. And for this, dozens of prisoners were dressed in animal skins and chained to mock temples, waiting for Commodus to strike them down with sword or arrow. And as the people watched, half horrified, half entranced, they began to wonder if the emperor could even tell the difference between myth and reality anymore. And the answer, whispered in dark corners, was no. He could not, and in fact he didn't care. For in his mind he had become the myth, and those who questioned it were traitors to be purged. And so Rome became a city of fear behind painted masks, where artists were forced to sculpt him as a god with thunderbolts, where poets who failed to praise his arena victories were flogged, and where even his own concubines were watched by spies to ensure their nightly moans matched the emperor's fantasies. And as Commodus drank wine laced with rare herbs to keep his body strong, bathed in perfumed water, and walked through halls lined with golden corpses, he laughed at the idea of death, believing himself beyond it, convinced that he would rule forever. And yet in the shadows, not everyone bowed willingly, for some had begun to plot quietly, carefully watching as the emperor descended further into madness. And they knew that while Commodus saw himself as Hercules reborn, more and more of Rome saw him for what he truly was: a butcher in a crown, a child in a god's costume, a madman playing with the bones of an empire that had once ruled the world. And as the Colosseum prepared for its next grand spectacle, and the gladiators whispered prayers before entering the pit, a different kind of tension spread, not the excitement of games, but the whisper of change, of danger, of something beginning to crack beneath the painted gold of Commodus's world. And though he strutted through the corridors with lion skins over his shoulders and blood still dripping from his blade, the eyes that once followed him in awe now looked away, fearful not just of him, but of what he might destroy next. By the 5th year of his reign, Commodus's world had turned into a mirror maze where every reflection praised him, feared him, adored him. But none showed the truth, and deep inside the imperial palace, past halls echoing with hollow laughter and courtyards lined with statues of himself dressed as gods, the emperor wandered drunk on power, wine, and illusion, no longer seeing people as citizens or subjects, but as audience members in a theater where he alone played the hero. And though he still performed in the Colosseum, slaughtering animals and condemned men in front of cheering crowds, his thirst for blood had begun to spill beyond the arena walls, reaching into the Senate, the barracks, the markets, and even the palace kitchens, because now anyone could become an enemy. Anyone could be punished, and his paranoia began to fester like an untreated wound, fed by whispers from his courtiers and flatterers who turned each rumor into firewood for his rage, until even a raised eyebrow or a poorly timed silence was treated as treason. And those who had once stood at his side, the advisors of Marcus Aurelius, the veterans of the frontier wars, the scholars and generals who had once helped Rome survive plagues and invasions, had either fled, been executed, or remained in silent terror, their mouths sealed by fear. And Commodus, surrounded by dancers, fools, and charlatans, began to see himself not only as Hercules, but as something greater, something eternal, claiming he had conquered death through divine strength and that his enemies were cursed to rot while he remained untouched. And it was in this fog of madness that the empire began to choke. For outside the palace, the streets of Rome filled with unrest as bread shortages grew worse, the treasury emptied, and corruption infected every office like a slow poison, with men paying bribes for governorships, military commands, even priesthoods, all sold openly by Cleander, Commodus's favorite and the real power behind the throne, a former slave who now controlled the empire's grain supply, the water, the courts, the Praetorian Guard, and the emperor's every whim. And his greed knew no bounds, extorting cities, crushing rivals, and living in splendor while citizens starved. And when a famine struck Rome and the people demanded justice, Cleander sent soldiers into the crowd, slaughtering protesters in the streets, turning Rome into a butcher's block. And for a brief moment, the spell broke. The people, once silenced by fear, rose in fury, storming the gates of the palace, chanting not against Commodus directly, but against Cleander, their anger boiling into rebellion. And Commodus, startled by the noise, turned on his favorite like a wild animal, ordering his arrest and execution within hours. His corpse dragged through the streets and left to rot as a scapegoat for the emperor's crimes. And yet the crowd was not satisfied, because they had seen through the lie. They had seen the emperor's cowardice, his madness, his emptiness behind the mask. And though Commodus tried to calm them with promises of more games, more gifts, more bread, something had shifted, and the eyes of Rome were no longer filled with awe, but with something colder, disgust. And even within the palace walls, things began to shift, as those closest to him realized that no amount of bloodshed could hide the fact that Rome was bleeding from within, and it was then that the poison began to drip. Not into his wine, not yet, but into his court, his inner circle, as whispers grew louder and heads leaned closer together in private corners, discussing what could be done, how the empire could be saved, and whether the emperor, mad as he was, could be removed without plunging Rome into civil war. And among those plotting was his own concubine, Marcia, once a loyal lover, now terrified by his mood swings and nightly rants, where he spoke of burning the Senate alive, of renaming all cities in his image, of building a temple where only he could be worshipped. And she saw in his eyes not love or power, but sickness, a growing rot that threatened to consume everyone around him. And as Commodus grew more erratic, executing servants for mistakes, beating courtiers in drunken rages, even threatening to slit Marcia's throat during a fit of jealousy, she knew that time was running out, that the man she once adored had become a beast in a golden cage, and outside the empire continued to fracture, with governors ignoring orders from Rome, provinces slipping into rebellion, and enemies pressing against the borders. Sensing weakness, because with the army loyal to their pay, and the pay gone, discipline collapsed and desertions spread like wildfire. And back in the Colosseum, Commodus continued to perform, declaring himself now not just Hercules reborn, but the new Romulus, founder of a second golden age, and in one of his most grotesque displays. He entered the arena in full divine costume and demanded senators fight mock battles against one another, laughing as they stumbled in fear, their robes soaked in sweat and shame, and though none dared refuse, the hatred burned in their hearts. And after that day, more joined the whispers, the plans, the poison, and Commodus, though he felt the shift, dismissed it all, declaring himself invincible. And one night, as he dined on exotic meats, drank spiced wine, and plotted a ceremony to crown himself the living Apollo, he wrote a list of names, people he would execute in the morning for disloyalty. And on that list was Marcia and the Praetorian commander Latus and his own chamberlain. And when Marcia discovered it, trembling as she read the writing in his own hand, something inside her broke, and she knew then that if they did not strike first, they would all be dead by sunrise. And so the poison finally left the shadows, not in a glass yet, but in resolve, because now the question was no longer if he would fall, but how and how soon, and who would survive the blood that followed. The palace, once echoing with music, laughter, and the roar of the crowd chanting Commodus's name, had grown eerily quiet, a place of hushed footsteps and sideways glances, where even the slaves dared not breathe too loud, because everyone knew something was coming, something terrible or something freeing. And as Commodus roamed its perfumed halls in his lion skins and golden sandals, declaring himself the new sun god, planning a grand celebration where he would appear as a living deity and re-inaugurate Rome in his name, he was blind to the fact that his closest allies had already begun digging his grave in silence, because the list he had written, his infamous death list, had passed from trembling hands to vengeful minds. And now Marcia, the woman he once adored, who had soothed his fits and applauded his murders, now hid terror behind her smile, for she had read her own name on that list, and beside it, the names of Latus, the Praetorian prefect, and Eclectus, the chamberlain, and they all understood what it meant. Commodus had finally crossed the line from dangerous to deadly, from madman to monster with no leash. And in that moment, a strange clarity settled over them, a quiet understanding that if they didn't kill him soon, he would kill them all and plunge the empire into chaos. And so the plot began, whispered first in corners, written in none of their hands, designed not as revenge but survival. And it was decided that Commodus would die quietly, efficiently, without spectacle or blood in the streets. And the date was set for the night of the Saturnalia, a festival of reversal and mischief, a night when all of Rome was drunk and distracted, and the emperor, as always, would be bathing and feasting in luxury, surrounded by incense, women, and wine, unaware that it would be his last night among the living. And as the plan solidified, Marcia prepared the poison herself, a white powder so bitter it could kill within minutes. And on the night of the feast, as Commodus lounged in his marble bath, boasting of his upcoming appearance in the arena where he would declare himself both god and emperor before the masses, she served him his favorite wine, spiced, warm, and laced with death, and watched him drink it in gulps, never suspecting, never questioning. And for a moment, it seemed the plan had succeeded, because minutes later he grew dizzy, his vision blurred, and his body slumped beneath the water. But then something went wrong. He vomited, violently expelling most of the poison, and his breathing steadied. And Marcia panicked, knowing that if he awoke, they were all dead. So she sent word to Latus, who sent his trusted wrestler, Narcissus, a brute trained for silence and strength. And while Commodus lay weak and dazed, the assassin slipped into the chamber, grabbed the emperor by the throat, and held him beneath the water until the ripples stopped. Until the divine heir of Marcus Aurelius, the self-declared god of the arena, was just a corpse floating in a perfumed bath, his golden curls drifting like weeds, his lips parted as if still asking for applause. And outside the walls, the people drank and danced, unaware that their emperor had been murdered not by sword or rebellion, but by the very hands that once caressed him. And as dawn broke over Rome, the city remained quiet. The guards kept their posts, and the Senate was informed not with panic but with relief. And in hushed tones they discussed the future, how to erase his name from public monuments, how to return dignity to a crumbling empire, and how to keep the murder quiet to avoid chaos. And for a moment, Rome stood still, teetering between ruin and recovery, the air heavy with the ghost of a man who had styled himself as invincible, who had fought in the arena 700 times, who had declared himself Hercules, Apollo, Jupiter, and king of all Rome, only to be strangled by a slave and dumped like refuse into a shallow grave. And those statues of him still stood across the empire. They would soon be torn down, melted, renamed, and rewritten, because history would not weep for Commodus. It would breathe a sigh of relief, but even in death, his legacy lingered like a wound, because what he left behind was not peace or pride, but fear, corruption, and spectacle. And though the Senate tried to restore order, the people had tasted madness, and madness does not vanish easily. And so while the emperor was gone, the disease he had spread, his hunger for performance, for blood, for power as theater, remained etched into the marble, whispered in the shadows and danced upon by those who would follow. Because Commodus had not just ruled Rome, he had infected it. And though his body rotted beneath the earth, his ghost still clung to the Colosseum, still waited in the silence before the crowd roars, still whispered from the shadows of history that a crown means nothing if not worn like a mask, and a throne means nothing unless it's soaked in fear. The body of Commodus had barely cooled before the Senate rushed to erase him from history, scrambling like frightened servants to undo 12 years of madness with words and marble chisels, passing decrees that labeled him a tyrant, a disgrace, an enemy of Rome, and ordering his name removed from statues, coins, temples, and even the city itself, which he had once arrogantly renamed Colonia Commodiana. And with trembling hands they restored it to simply Rome, as if that alone could wash away the blood he had spilled and the shame he had smeared across the empire. But the damage ran deeper than names or monuments, because Commodus had done more than just play God. He had taught the people to fear power dressed as theater, to cheer for cruelty if it wore a golden mask, and to mistake madness for strength if it roared loud enough. And that sickness could not be buried with his corpse, because it had spread like smoke through every street, every barracks, every forum and bathhouse, where whispers still told stories of the emperor who fought like a gladiator, who made senators bleed in the arena, who hunted men like beasts for applause. And while the elite tried to forget him, the people could not, because Commodus had given them something they understood: spectacle, blood, and the illusion of glory. And even in death, he remained a ghost on their tongues. And the city, desperate to move forward, appointed Pertinax, an aging, principled man who had once served Marcus Aurelius, hoping that a return to discipline and reason would heal the empire. But Commodus had ruled too long, and the scars he left behind were too deep, because the Praetorian Guard, once protectors of the emperor, had become spoiled and dangerous under his reign, used to luxury and bribes. And when Pertinax refused to play their game, refused to buy their loyalty with gold and flattery, they murdered him in broad daylight, proving that Commodus's rot had reached even the heart of Rome's power. And what followed was a nightmare. The empire put up for sale to the highest bidder, with the throne auctioned off to a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, who paid a fortune for the crown, but lasted only 9 weeks before he too was killed. And the streets of Rome ran red again, not with the blood of beasts or criminals, but with emperors, as generals across the provinces began declaring themselves Caesar, plunging the empire into a year of civil war and chaos. And through it all, the memory of Commodus lingered, a curse no decree could lift, because he had not just ruled badly, he had shattered the sacred illusion of imperial dignity, dragging the purple robe through the dirt and making the title of emperor a joke to be bought, sold, or fought over. And in the provinces, governors trembled, unsure who to obey. Soldiers questioned orders, bandits roamed freely, and rebels declared new gods in forgotten corners. Because when the center of the world collapses, its echo shakes everything around it. And though Septimius Severus eventually rose from the bloodshed to seize control, claiming the throne and restoring some sense of order, even he could not ignore Commodus's ghost, for he knew that the people still remembered the games, still remembered the golden boy with the sword and lion skin, and so he made a calculated decision not to bury the memory, but to weaponize it. And in a strange twist, Severus declared Commodus to be a god, reversing the Senate's damnatio memoria, raising him to divine status not because he deserved it, but because Severus needed to secure his own rule. And honoring the previous emperor, even a mad one, was a tool of propaganda too powerful to ignore. And so the man who had been strangled in a bath and mocked as a lunatic was now prayed to as a divine ancestor. And the people, confused but obedient, once again lit candles to his name, as if the blood and shame had all been a dream. And that is the legacy Commodus left behind, a Rome where truth meant nothing, where power could reshape memory, where madness could be sanctified if it served the empire. And the Colosseum, still standing like a silent witness, kept his secrets buried beneath the sand. The roar of the crowd still echoing faintly in the stone, as if waiting for the god emperor to rise again, for one more fight, one more performance, one more scream of triumph before the sword came down. Even in death, Commodus refused to rest, not in marble silence or forgotten dust, because while his corpse had been tossed into an unmarked grave and his memory briefly condemned by the Senate, his spirit lived on like a sickness that could not be cured, infecting the empire with the idea that Rome no longer needed wisdom or virtue, only noise, fear, and spectacle. And though new emperors rose to take his place, men like Septimius Severus, who spoke of law and stability, they too saw the truth that Commodus had revealed, that the crowd was a beast that roared only for blood and theater, that loyalty could be bought with silver and fear, and that an emperor did not need to be good, only entertaining, terrifying, and divine. And so the sickness spread, not through battles but through beliefs, infecting palaces and forms alike. As statues of Commodus were quietly restored, his divine titles whispered again in temples, not out of reverence but convenience, because it was easier to use his ghost than to erase it. And Severus, clever and ruthless, declared Commodus a god to gain favor with the mob, and the people, hungry for bread and distraction, accepted the lie, lighting incense at shrines while their stomachs growled. And in doing so, they sealed the curse he left behind. For now the madman was a martyr. His madness turned to myth, his cruelty twisted into heroism, and the Colosseum, once a place of civic pride and sacred ritual, became a haunted theater where each new emperor felt the pull of the sand, the seduction of the roar, and though no one ever fought as Commodus had, his shadow loomed over every game, every triumph, every death. And in the Senate, where once Cicero had spoken of justice and Cato had died for principle, men now bowed to emperors not out of duty but terror, their tongues poisoned by decades of corruption and showmanship. And across the empire, governors ruled with violence and pageantry, copying the mask of Commodus even as they cursed his name, because he had shown them that image was power, that fear could replace law, and that the people would accept anything so long as it was wrapped in gold and blood. And in the provinces, rebellion simmered, not against Rome itself, but against the emptiness it had become, a hollow empire filled with statues of gods who no longer watched and emperors who no longer led. And as plague returned, famine spread, and borders weakened, many whispered that the gods had cursed Rome, not because of her enemies, but because she had crowned a lunatic and called him divine. And the curse did not fade, because once a people learn to cheer for cruelty, they forget how to weep for justice. And that was the darkest legacy of Commodus. Not the taxes he raised or the generals he executed, not even the games or the murders or the orgies, but the way he rewrote the soul of Rome, turning it into a theater of illusions where truth was just another prop. And long after his death, his stories still lived in taverns and temples, where old men told children about the god who killed lions with his bare hands, who faced 1,000 gladiators and never bled. who renamed Rome after himself and made even the stars bow to his will. And they told these stories not as warnings, but as wonders, forgetting the screams, the corruption, the slow death of dignity, and instead remembering only the roar of the crowd and the glint of gold on oiled skin. And in that forgetting, the curse deepened, until even wise men began to ask if perhaps Commodus had been right, if perhaps fear and fire were better than order and reason. And so Rome continued, walking forward with its eyes closed, wearing a mask made by a dead man who had once danced on the edge of madness and called it glory. And though his bones lay rotting in silence, his laughter still echoed through the stones of the Colosseum, and every time an emperor stood before the people, he could feel the ghost of Commodus at his back, whispering that thrones are built not on law, but on spectacle, not on virtue, but on performance, and that Rome would never again belong to the just, only to those who knew how to bleed with style. It was a night thick with perfume and poison, the kind of night where Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, not in reverence, but in anticipation, as if the ancient city knew something monstrous was about to end. And inside the imperial palace, behind walls carved with golden lions and ceilings painted with scenes of Commodus as a god, the emperor lounged in his bath like a beast too fat to hunt, his skin oiled, his hair combed, and his voice slurring as he muttered about the next day's grand event. For he had declared that he would open the new year not as Caesar, but as a gladiator in full armor, entering the arena before the entire Roman world and crowning himself as the living Hercules, the god of gods, master of all men, and ruler of all beasts. And as he soaked in his scented water, boasting of the number of men he would slay and the gold statues he would raise in his own image, a cup of wine laced with deadly poison sat gently in his hand, given to him with trembling care by Marcia, the woman he once trusted, the woman he had named a goddess beside him, the same woman whose name he had written onto his kill list that very morning. And as he drank deeply and smiled, unaware of what burned down his throat, she watched with hollow eyes and silent fury. And for a moment it seemed death had taken him quietly, his eyes going glassy, his head leaning back against the marble edge. But then he began to cough, violently, spewing the poison back up, his body spasming, his strength returning too quickly for a peaceful end. And Marcia's heart turned to ice, because she knew the moment he opened his eyes again, she was dead. They were all dead. And so she fled, summoning Latus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, and Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain, both of whom had seen their own names on the list and understood that now there was no turning back. And together they sent word to Narcissus, a wrestler of great size and loyalty, who had once served as Commodus's trainer and now would become his executioner. And Narcissus slipped quietly into the emperor's private chamber, where Commodus, woozy and half-conscious, groaned and tried to stand, confused by the silence, by the absence of applause. And then Narcissus was on him, silent and brutal, wrapping his arms around the emperor's neck, dragging him into the water and holding him there. And Commodus thrashed and kicked. But the poison had dulled him, and the strength he had flaunted for years was no match for real fury. And with a final gurgle, the self-proclaimed god of Rome drowned in the very bath he had used to pamper himself, his face submerged beneath rose petals and blood-tinged water, his eyes wide open until they were not. And when it was done, Narcissus slipped away. And the silence in the palace was deafening, broken only by the soft footsteps of servants who already understood without being told. And the next morning, the city of Rome awoke not to parades or trumpet blasts, but to the quiet word passed from mouth to mouth. Commodus was dead. The god was gone. The madness had ended, or so they hoped. And the Senate, which had hidden its spine for over a decade, found it again with trembling courage, immediately denouncing the dead emperor, ordering his memory erased, his statues torn down, his name cursed, and his titles revoked, declaring him not a god, but a tyrant, a disgrace, a shame to the empire. And yet the people of Rome, so used to cheering for his violence, so used to his golden face smiling from every wall, mourned in their own strange way, some cheering, some confused, some wondering if the next emperor would feed them as well as Commodus had, if he would give them games, bread, and someone to fear and worship. Because for all his madness, Commodus had given them something simple, a story. And now that story was over, and Rome, staggering beneath its own weight, tried to move forward, tried to forget the boy who became a god in his own mind, who killed with joy and ruled with vanity, who dressed as Hercules and bled the empire dry. But forgetting him was impossible, because Commodus had turned the throne into a stage, the Senate into puppets, and the people into an audience that had tasted madness and found it sweet. And though new emperors would come, they would all rule in his shadow, haunted by the image of a man who made power into theater and death into applause. And even as his body rotted in a shallow grave, buried without ceremony, without incense, without tears, the curse of his reign lingered in every corner of the empire, whispering that glory was nothing but spectacle, and truth was whatever made the crowd cheer. And so Commodus died not just in flesh, but in myth, not just as a man, but as a monster dressed in gold who taught Rome how to clap for its own destruction. When the gods of old were forgotten, and the Colosseum stood quiet in the mornings, shivering in its own shadow, Rome remembered Commodus, not with reverence, not even always with hatred, but with a twisted fascination, as though the ghost of the gladiator emperor had never truly died, only slipped beneath the stones of the arena, waiting for his name to be spoken again. And though the Senate tried to erase him, and poets cursed his madness in bitter verses, the truth was that Commodus had left a scar on the empire deeper than any sword ever could. For in life he had turned the throne into a circus ring, power into a costume, and the Roman people into spectators rather than citizens, teaching them that emperors didn't need wisdom or courage, only noise, fear, and the strength to hold a sword with style. And long after his strangled corpse had vanished into the dirt, long after his name was scratched off tablets and his statues melted down, the empire still trembled beneath the weight of what he had shown them. That chaos, when made beautiful, could be mistaken for greatness, and so even Septimius Severus, who took the throne after civil war and bloodshed, eventually declared Commodus a god, not out of belief, but out of fear and strategy, because it was easier to canonize a monster than to admit the empire had been ruled by one. And so Commodus became a divine figure again, his crimes polished into legend, his madness retold as divine eccentricity, and temples once red with his enemies' blood now hosted ceremonies in his honor. And as the years passed, his image returned, on coins and murals, in whispered stories told to children not as warnings, but as wonders of the emperor who fought in the arena, who killed lions and giants, who renamed Rome after himself and crowned himself Hercules on earth. And in this retelling, the horror was lost, the fear softened, and the truth buried beneath the applause of history, because humans, then as now, love a story more than they love the truth. And Commodus had given them the most intoxicating story of all. A boy raised in palaces who turned into a beast in gold, who ruled the greatest empire in history like it was his personal arena, who made death into entertainment and vanity into policy. And though he fell, drowned in his own madness and betrayal, the empire never truly recovered, because what he had broken, the line between emperor and god, ruler and performer, justice and spectacle, was never repaired. And every emperor who followed would carry a sliver of his shadow, whether they knew it or not, because Commodus had exposed what Rome could become when power forgot its purpose, when violence was worshipped, and when applause became more important than law. And so if you walk today among the ruins of the Colosseum, if you listen closely to the wind that drags across the broken seats and shattered arches, you might hear something beneath it, a whisper, a laugh, a ghost still grinning beneath a lion's skin, reminding you that monsters are not born. They are made, fed by cheers, gold, and silence. And sometimes the worst emperors do not die with their bodies, but live forever in the way we remember them and forget the warnings they left behind. If this story gripped you, if the rise and madness of Commodus chilled your bones and opened your eyes to the dark side of history, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe for more haunting true stories from ancient Rome and beyond. Leave a comment telling us what shocked you most. And remember, history doesn't just repeat, it performs. Stay curious. Stay haunted.